Hello and welcome to History by Hollywood, a podcast series that examines the real events and people behind fact-based movies. This is episode 71.1 for Sunday the 15th of March 2020, and this week's movie is 2016's Denial, starring Rachel Weisz as American historian and author Deborah Lipstadt and Timothy Spall as British historical author and Holocaust denier David Irving. My name is Andrew Blischik, and with me as ever is Martin Darlington. Hello, Martin.
Hello, Andrew. Hello, everybody. Okay, we're back, and we have a big announcement. Sadly, we both have multiple distractions in the real world, quite apart from the recent coronavirus crisis, which we still don't really know how or if it will affect us. Our experiment with the weekly segmented format has pretty much failed to alleviate the pressure of release dates to the degree that we'd hoped. Therefore, and with due apologies to those of you who stuck with us and been so understanding about our need to try and keep the quality whilst not diluting the quantity too much, we have to make a further change. The good news is we're going to get rid of the 71.1, 71.2 episode bits, and we're going to return to a single episode for a single movie. So this could be as short as 35 minutes, which is the short end record was Sound of Music, I think, or as long as 3 hours plus, which the recent Shakespeare supplementary would have been had it gone out as a single show. The bad news is that we're going to have to publish when we're ready, and it's very unlikely, in fact we can pretty much say it won't be the original schedule of fortnightly episodes. So we've removed the dates from the planned episodes page, although the page and its list of forthcoming movies will remain extant. And as soon as we know a publication date, that episode will be updated to reflect the information. We do apologise, but I think we were both finding it. We were starting to lose our love for the show just through the pressure of having to meet schedules. We got family life, we got professional life to deal with, to balance. And we don't want to start resenting the show. We want to keep loving it, but we promise we won't quite go to the Dan Carlin level of one episode and then the next one doesn't come along for 5 months. But it will be irregular, probably, depending on what's going on in our lives at the time. So, like we say, apologies. We hope you guys stick with us.
Yeah, I think realistically, it's gonna be once a month, maybe if we're lucky. But let's see how we go. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Just all we can ask is that you keep us in your wherever you get your podcast from, and the feed will update when a new show comes out. We will, of course, announce it in the normal areas on Twitter, on the Facebook group, and as I say, on the planned episodes page of the website, historybyhollywood.com, and it's the homepage. If a date appears, that's because we know when it's going to come out. And as you'll have already seen, this show has been delayed a week.
Okay, well, moving on to news and errata and such. The first update we'd like to say is that we recently made mention of the sad death of Katherine Johnson, one of the mathematical geniuses who worked at NASA and was featured in the movie Hidden Figures. But what we failed to mention was that this news was brought to our attention by listener Nick Parkinson, who sent us a link to the story and without whom we might have missed that news. So thank you very much, Nick.
Yeah, and in light of this week's episode, Denial, there's a very interesting, it's only 14 minutes, it's a YouTube documentary about how to confront lies and false news or false facts in the internet era. And it was made in response to the release of this movie. It features the real Deborah Lipstadt and the real Anthony Julius. So we will include a link in the show notes to that, and it is worth a watch.
Yeah, okay. And under the category of listener feedback, we heard from a long-running friend of the show, Sean Munger, whose new show, alongside his co-presenter Cody Clymer, continues. That's his Green Screen podcast, which examines movies with an environmental aspect. After the China Syndrome, they covered Star Trek 4 and Invasion of the Body Snatchers, both of which sound rather fun. Sean did mention that as far as the Social Network movie went, he wasn't too impressed with the movie, but he concedes that this puts him in a minority. Sean then points out that he is one of the 37% of viewers who like the movie Jefferson in Paris, so maybe it's no surprise that he's a bit of a contrarian. Phil Pomerantz, a loyal friend of the show, wrote in with an article bringing our attention to an article recently published by the deceased physicist Freeman Dyson about working with the RAF during World War II to help develop bombing techniques. We'll include a link to that show for this article written for Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 2006.
We also heard from newish listener Brad Michael from Colorado. Brad is working his way through the back catalogue, so he may not hear his shout out for some time. But he made a suggestion that, were it a spaniel, would doggy paddle effectively around the pool, retrieve the thrown stick and drop it at its owner's feet before shaking itself dry and soaking any bystander within a 3-metre radius. I do like a tortured analogy, sorry. And Brad's suggestion was Pierpoint, The Last Hangman, a movie about which I wasn't even aware of. Have you heard of it, Andrew?
No, not until this correspondence. It really went under the radar, didn't it?
Yeah, and this also stars Timothy Spall, who we're meeting in Denial, and the movie covers part of the life of Albert Pierpoint, who was Britain's last official executioner. He would hang hundreds of criminals during his career, but was always viewed as a decent human being who took his duties and responsibilities very seriously and eventually became quite vehemently anti-capital punishment. He was also selected to go to Nuremberg after the Nazi war crimes and dispatched a lot of condemned Nazi war criminals. This is also portrayed. I mean, we think it's a surefire movie for us to cover, but given its inexplicable anonymity, at least amongst the two of us, we would welcome any input from other listeners who've seen or heard of it. I was interested that, Brad's in Colorado, he's an American, and yet he's seen and really enjoyed this film. And if this Brad is the same reviewer, the same as reviewer G-Man Brad, who was so kind about our lack of rabbit holing and waffling, I'm so sorry for what Jules and I inflicted on you over the last few weeks. So, oops.
And we've also received an incredibly valuable contribution to many aspects of our next outing. The People versus Larry Flint suggestion, which came from Christina Dockstader, for which we're very grateful, while acknowledging in the light of our earlier announcements, we can't yet give a date for the release of that movie's episode. So sorry about the confusion, folks. But thank you, Christina, for yet another good suggestion.
Yeah, and the information sheet that Christina sent was full of great little details that would have taken a lot of digging to reveal and add to our research. So that's really appreciated. We've also heard from David Amble. David's been a fairly regular correspondent, and he was he's been on Catch Up, he was referring to the Shakespeare episodes and agreed that the Kenneth Branagh version of Henry V is much better than Laurence Olivier's, albeit acknowledging that Laurence Olivier's was made for its time in the 40s and during World War II. And he does say, thinking of Shakespeare for historical accuracy, then applying it to his plays, then applying it in ways that Hollywood portrays it, is kind of like playing the telephone game, where you get 10 plus kids and you tell one kid the story and they pass it to the next and they pass it to the next, and the final version is very rarely the same as the first. So that was a good shout. And he also recommended a podcast called Business Wars, which covers a wide range of historical topics about business, and they do about 5 episodes per incident, and they're just discussing at the moment Harley Davidson and the motorcycle industry in the US. So that's very, very appreciated, David, and thank you. Now, I'm just going to interrupt myself because we've had a review in late breaking news. This is from Stukely1 from the UK, and he gives us 5 stars, which is very nice, entitled The Dam Busters. I'm so glad I stumbled on this podcast. It is an absolutely essential item for the podcast library of any history buff. Well formatted and researched. I cannot praise it enough. It's 5 stars from me. And that was on March the 12th. So thank you so much, Stukely. I'm glad we managed to get it into this week's episode, because we're not sure when the next episode will be. And now back to me and Andrew. And now,
as always, let's start with the story of the movie. This week's movie, Denial. Denial was released in 2016, and the movie cost a modest $10 million to make, but returned an even more modest $9.2 million in the worldwide box office. Given our recent correspondences with Professor Mark Dupre regarding the unseen costs of distribution and marketing, this must have been considered a really poor return on investment, which is a shame, as the movie has a very important story to tell, which it manages to narrate in an entertaining and fairly dramatic fashion, or that's what we think so far. The main characters showed off some accomplished actors. Rachel Weisz playing Deborah Lipstadt, Timothy Spall taking on the role of the loathsome David Irving, but playing him in such a way to avoid the guise of a pantomime villain. Tom Wilkinson, the aristocratic and veteran barrister Richard Rampton, who would represent Deborah and her publisher Penguin Books in court, and rounded out with Irish actor Andrew Scott playing the unflappable solicitor Anthony Julius.
Yeah, the critical reception was more encouraging than that of audiences. The aggregate critical score on Rotten Tomatoes is 82%. Audiences coming in at a barely respectable 71%. There are few criticisms of any of the performance, but audience reviews seem to gripe about the cinematography and screenplay. And now the director was British veteran Mick Jackson, best known previously for directing The Bodyguard with Kevin Costner and Whitney Houston. And the screenplay was written by playwright David Hare. And I mean, we've both said it. We found it gripping, but possibly that's the lead performances and the subject matter. The period covered by the movie is in years, and there was a lot of preparation to this, and you don't get that sense. They don't manage to convey the passage of time. You could watch the movie and think, well, this must have all happened in the space of a month, or it possibly even less.
A couple of weeks.
Yeah, so I sort of understand it, but I did enjoy it. I didn't want to stop watching it, and it's nicely trimmed. I mean, it's less than 2 hours long, so which is quite rare these days. Yeah. Okay.
Well, shall we get on with the meat and potatoes and look at the story and how they did getting the history right?
Absolutely. So the opening scenes, the titles tell us this is based on a true story. Then we hear British historian David Irving, played by Timothy Spall, speaking in Canada, denying that anyone died in the gas chambers at Auschwitz. We then jump to our other antagonist, Deborah Lipstadt, played by Rachel Weisz. She's an American professor and author, and she's talking to a class of students about Holocaust denial. And she says the arguments can fall into 4 categories, and this is quite a good sort of opening way of explaining to us. She says, 1, some people will say, 1, there was no systematic attempt to exterminate Jews by the Nazis. 2, the numbers are far fewer than 5 or 6 million. 3, there were no purpose-built facilities to carry out this extermination. And 4, and probably most outrageously, some people will suggest this is a myth put about by Jews to promote the interests of the State of Israel. She then challenges her class with a question, but how do we prove it happened? There were no photos taken because the Nazis made sure there were none taken. And so how do we know today that this happened? And that they have a little back and forth with the students. We then cut to her home in Atlanta, and Deborah's going to work complete with a border collie. She's getting ready to give a presentation about a recent book she published, Denying the Holocaust. She's introduced to her audience, but we see, lurking backstage, David Irving. A lady asked why Professor Lipstadt won't debate with deniers, and she said, well, I won't debate with people who say Elvis is alive. She'll happily debate opinions, but not the existence of facts. Another audience member, a male member, asks her why she denigrates the work of David Irving, and she says she doesn't really, he's not worth her time. And at this stage, David Irving gate crashes her speech, and we've got a little clip.
Professor Lipstadt, let me reveal something to you, Professor. I am that David Irving about whom you have been so rude. Yes, I am he. And it puzzles me that you think yourself qualified to attack me, given that I have 30 years' experience in the archives. And my books have been published by some of the greatest publishing houses in the world. Viking Press, William Morrow, E.P. Dutton. I have to conclude that the reason you don't engage with people you disagree with is because you can't. And you might learn some facts, Miss Lipstadt, which don't suit your opinions. Well.
So his sort of conclusion, it gets quite shouty, and he offers $1,000 to any charity that anyone chooses if anyone can prove that Hitler ordered the final solution against Europe's Jews. Eventually he's quietened down by security, but not before he offers to give free copies of his book to anyone who wants one, and he'll see them outside. So, quite a bit to unpack there. How did they do?
Well, I think they've managed to convey a lot of facts in that neat little let's use a lecture scene. The opening does quite a good job at that, and we see some of Irving's extreme beliefs in that Canada clip. And then we have Lipstadt responding to a real list of things that Holocaust deniers rely on to peddle their baloney. David Irving, as the movie portrays, let's just set the scene for these two characters then, now that we've met both the main protagonists. David Irving, as the movie shows, is a self-taught historian and the author of several books on World War II. He made his mark with the book The History of the Dresden Bombing, called Destruction of Dresden in 1963, where he reviewed the Allies who bombed the crap out of what was ostensibly a non-military city, causing lots of civilian German deaths. Now, the general historical consensus is that the bombing of Dresden killed approximately 25,000 civilians, which is terrible. Irving's book claims that this figure is anywhere between 50,000 to 100,000 civilians, depending on which edition of his book that you read. The numbers, I think, went up as subsequent editions were published. In addition to the Dresden book, he's also closely examined aspects of Hitler's life, and in 1983 was brought in by the UK Sunday Times to examine some diaries that had been bought by the German magazine Der Spiegel in the belief that these were Hitler's personal diaries. Irving did a sterling job as to why these diaries that Der Spiegel had were fake, and he identified many inconsistencies in the diaries with his knowledge of the historical record. He was well respected for his work on the diaries, and his other works prior to the trial, there were lots, and they added to his reputation that he was quite a detailed historian, especially looking at things from the German side. His other works included Hitler's War, The Trail of the Fox about Erwin Rommel, and Churchill's War. So that brings his track record up until the time of the trial. Deborah, off you go.
Oh, right. Deborah Lipstadt is a Holocaust historian, and as the movie shows, was a Holocaust academic in Atlanta, Georgia at the time of the trial. She had a good reputation, or she has a good reputation as a historian, and clearly of Jewish heritage, is well regarded and an objective scholar. She studied in Israel, and as the movie states, she's a published author, including a book titled Denying the Holocaust, The Growing Assault on Truth and Memory, in which she characterised some of Irving's writings and public statements as Holocaust denial. One of the passages that David Irving objected to is, and I quote, "Irving is one of the most dangerous spokespersons for Holocaust denial. Familiar with historical evidence, he bends it until it conforms with his ideological leanings and political agenda. A man who is convinced that Britain's great decline was accelerated by its decision to go to war with Germany, he is most facile at taking accurate information and shaping it to confirm his conclusions." A review of his recent book, Churchill's War, which appeared in a New York Review of Books, accurately analysed his practice of applying a double standard of evidence. He demands absolute documentary proof when it comes to proving German guilt, but he relies on highly circumstantial evidence to condemn the Allies. This is an accurate description not only of Irving's tactics, but those of deniers in general. End quote.
Yeah, so that's one of the offending passages that caused him to bring the trial against her. The scene where we see Irving hijack one of her Atlanta lectures is not true, and according to her 2005 book on that trial, the book's called History on Trial, My Day in Court with a Holocaust Denier. This was the first time she'd ever met Irving face to face, and that was in the London Law Court at the time of this case. So that whole raucous lecture scene and the $1,000 offer that he's handing around that money, that didn't happen, and it's a dramatic fiction of the movie.
Yeah. So Deborah receives a letter. This is back to the movie now. Deborah receives a letter from Penguin Books in London telling her that David Irving is suing Penguin and Deborah, claiming that she and the publisher are trying to ruin his reputation in a concerted campaign of smears. She goes online and reads his blog, and it looks very much like a Trump tweet. There's lots of capitals and exclamation marks. We see a series of clips of Irving, which Deborah is watching, I assume on YouTube or on TV, addressing German right-wing rallies, being interviewed on TV. And after all of this, Deborah, in conversation with Penguin, says, "No, let's fight. Let's fight this in court." And Penguin are brilliant. They're like, "Yep." So Yeah, how did that go on the
Yeah,
setup?
that's all pretty good. As the movie shows, she first got wind of this law action by Irving to her Atlanta University address, and she initially thought this was some laughable accusation and that no one would take it seriously. Lipstadt herself, in her 2005 book, says that she was in no position to pretty much do anything other than fight for her reputation. She couldn't have paid Irving some money for him to go away, and as the movie shows, she was determined to fight the accusations. And they quite rightly, they got that bit right, that there were two parties that were served with the legal action, Penguin and Lipstadt. So the publisher is seen as separate to the author, and apparently that's quite common, where they're seen as two entities for such actions. And Lipstadt in the book makes it plain that her biggest fear was that Penguin would do a logical decision and say, if we pay Irving, I don't know, £10,000, £20,000 and seal up a decision with him, that's going to be much cheaper than us going with a raft of lawyers for a court case that might drag on for months, if not years. The logical thing might have been just to throw some money at the problem and have it go away, and that would have been a nightmare for Lipstadt because she couldn't afford to, come up with a similar amount of money, and her reputation would suffer a lot more if she was said to have apologised for saying something accurate but offensive to Irving.
He could suggest that, or people could infer that was an admission of guilt.
Exactly,
yeah.
Exactly. But as you've already hinted, Penguin were stuck to the cause. They were really good. They stood behind their author when they didn't really have to, and they fought the accusations together. In fact, they had the same barrister representing them, even though they had different solicitors advising on the way up. But we'll get to that shortly.
Yeah, so Deborah is then introduced and meets Anthony Julius, played by Andrew Scott. Some people might know him from the Sherlock series. He plays Moriarty in the Sherlock series.
He's Fleabag's sexy priest as well. That's his most recent claim to fame.
Ah, right. Irish actor, but plays smooth-talking British lawyer Anthony Julius very well. He asks what made her choose him and says, was it the Diana thing? And we learn that Julius represented Princess Diana during her divorce. He also explains to Deborah that he'll prepare the case, but he won't present it, because in Britain, solicitors and barristers are two different roles. They're all lawyers, but it's a specialist thing, the presentation in court. And now we've got a little clip, and this is Julius explaining to Deborah about the presumption of innocence, and it's a bit of a shock.
Deborah, I have to warn you that there's a reason why he's bringing the case in London.
I wondered about that.
Yeah, it's to his advantage. Over here in America, if you're accused of defaming someone, then it's up to them to prove that what you said is untrue. In the UK, the reverse is true.
Wait, I have to prove what I said was true?
Correct.
But I'm the innocent party. A man accuses you of something and it's your job to prove he's wrong? It's against natural justice. In the US, there's a presumption of innocence.
Yeah, not in the UK. Tricky, isn't it?
So, how do they do?
All that stuff's spot on. The Julius is represented quite accurately. She did get pointed in his direction by a friend, and as the movie shows, he really had authored a scholarly book about D.H. Lawrence's anti-Semitism. And he also did, after representing Princess Diana in a privacy matter, as he says, some illicit photos from her gym got out there, and he helped her get some restitution for that. And in turn, he then did represent her in his first divorce case. So they're all pretty accurate about Julius so far. So that's good.
Yeah. Now we should point out, particularly for the non-British audience, that this bit about it's different in Britain about presumption of innocence. That's only in a very specific small amount of civil cases. In criminal law, of course, there is the presumption of innocence. There does seem to be an exception in certain defamation of character cases, although this can also vary and it's very complicated. I read through several articles about it, and these legal documents or legal statements, and they have sentences that go on for pages. And it's just, I just lost my way. So hence the need for very highly qualified and very expensive lawyers, I guess. So he's right. In her specific case, the onus is on her to prove that what she said, leading to Irving's inferred defamation of character, was accurate and therefore was not libelous. And I think libel is written, isn't it, and slander is spoken.
Verbal.
Now, the check on that is that people who are sued for defamation of character, who find the onus on them, the burden of proof is on them, they often counter-sue, replacing the burden back on the person who made the original accusation, and these can go on for years, some of these cases. That didn't happen in this case, but just in case people are going, what? So in Britain you're guilty to proven innocent? It's only in this very specific, narrow defamation area that's the case, I think.
And yes, and no doubt why Irving brought the accusations in a British court and not an American court, even though Lipstadt's American.
Exactly. So, back to the movie. It's 1998, central London, and we see David Irving at home with his young daughter. He has a housekeeper, and she answers the door to two young legal types, and these are part of Anthony Julius's team, and they're delivering documentation for the discovery process, but they also ask the very polite David Irving if he keeps a diary. They would like it to be entered into the process of discovery, and he says, I'm not sure about Deborah Lipstadt being able to read my diary. They said, no, access is limited to the legal team. She would only learn anything that's relevant to the case. And he sort of laughs and thinks he's got one over on him. He says, I've kept a diary for over 20 years and written between 10 and 20 million words. And so they obviously they're going to be swamped with information. Meanwhile, Deborah arrives in London where, lo and behold, it's raining. She's introduced to an extensive legal team by Anthony Julius, plus some academics who are going to be supporting her case by researching. So the team outline her options. They quickly work out the only real option for her to take without acknowledging Irving's work as viable is to take what Julius describes as the atom bomb defence, which is to say everything she said is justified and can be substantiated. Not only her facts, but the fact that Irving has deliberately falsified facts or obscured facts to satisfy his political ideology. One element that shocks Deborah is the legal team is saying survivors will not be allowed to give testimony because by doing that, they justify Irving's right to question them. So it's not just about talking the facts and getting everybody up there. It's about making sure, they describe it later on as starving him of oxygen. So the legal team have a comprehensive plan in place. They scour through his diary for any contacts with right-wing groups, whilst the academic team will be reading every word he's ever written. They also have already gathered that Irving is going to be representing himself, a signal of his confidence and also his ego. Before she leaves, Anthony Julius says, look, it's going to take about a year to prepare this, and although we did intend to represent you pro bono, due to the work it's going to take, we will need some funds raised just to, pay wages. So the legal team were quite happy to say, no, we'll do this on a no-win, no-fee basis. And he did say, look, if we lose, there's no cost, obviously, but we're going to need some funds up front. So Deborah goes around to schmooze some Jewish groups to see if they'll donate. Now, this is one of those areas where we don't really get an impression of how long these things took, because the next scene, she's at dinner with a British Jewish group who are quite reluctant. They live with David Irving, who they view as a has-been, and they're worried that this will revive his career and profile, and they want her to settle. But she argues, accusing them of appeasement, at which they bridle. But in between that discussion with Anthony Julius and the scene with dinner, she's obviously been to the US because the US Jewish groups have stumped up without question. So
that's right.
It
could be something like a year between that conversation and the dinner, which is what Julius had said. It's going to take us months and months and months, if not years, a year to prepare this, and that is accurate. That's what actually happened in the book.
Yeah. So how did they do on all of that?
They did pretty good. The bit about the diaries being handed over, from what I recall in the book, they did need to request them formally from him, and Irving was reluctant to hand them over, but eventually the law court said it was part of the discovery information and he had to hand them over. So he was more reluctant, from what I recall, than what the movie shows, but they definitely did get them, and they were a crucial part of proving his character. The scene where he's got a dark-skinned housekeeper, which seems a little bit odd if he's such an Aryan fan. It's actually correct. He does make a big deal of the fact in the that he employs people of all different ethnicities, and he tries to turn that against Lipstadt's legal team, saying that unlike the law firms that are representing her, he's got a very ethnically diverse workforce.
And we had this large legal team working for Deborah and Penguin, and the strategy was, I believe, as shown. Now, we haven't got to this bit in the movie yet, but they actually didn't want the Holocaust survivors or Deborah herself to speak, on the basis that that would allow Irving to nitpick and put them on trial, as it were. And she really found that difficult,
yes,
which will be shown later on. But he did choose to represent himself, didn't he?
And as Julius, and it wasn't all to do with ego and wanting to have his moment in the limelight. And as Anthony Julius says in the movie, they did offer immediately to do all their work pro bono, but they did have a small army of researchers, historians and investigators, and those sorts of experts won't come cheap. So funds were a real worry to Lipstadt, who after all was just a humble Atlanta academic. In her book on the trial, Lipstadt goes to great lengths to detail how many anonymous Jewish and non-Jewish benefactors pledged funds for her fight. Strangers would approach her in the street and say that she needs to fight and win, and often offer to fund her, and this was whether she was in the US or London. In fact, her own university, Emory in Georgia, without being asked, offered to pay her salary throughout the trial, and they also kicked in some $40,000 US into her fighting fund, which is a very, very generous commitment to their employee. And from what I recall of the book on the trial, nobody tried to talk her out of it. No Jewish group or individual said, it's best if we fly on the radar, just give him some money and this will all go away. I'm pretty sure that was invented for the movie, because it was she found it a very humbling and positive experience of how many people, complete strangers, were going to support her in this fight.
And she does mention at one point in the movie, doesn't she, that I think when she goes back to Julius and says, yeah, we've got all this money, that actually one individual, I think an American Jew, had said, well, I'll just pay for everything. You know, he's obviously a multi-millionaire. And she said, I don't, it's got to be a group action. It's got to be group support. I don't want one person, because then it becomes personal. And it could just be, look, you're just representing this megalomaniac, Jewish billionaire, whatever. So that was interesting. So back to the movie. Deborah's now set up in London in rented accommodation, and she goes for early morning runs. And then we see her talking to Anthony Julius about the dinner with the British Jewish group. And he's unsurprised and unflustered by the fact that they wanted to settle. He then takes her to the offices of a barrister, Richard Rampton, played by the wonderful Tom Wilkinson. And he's a typically upper-class British man. Rampton offers wine before talking about the case. And Anthony Julius is like, yeah, it's before lunchtime. I haven't eaten yet. No, thank you. But Rampton reveals he doesn't yet speak German, but intends to learn. He smokes, drinks, enjoys fishing, and he also tells Deborah he needs to visit Auschwitz and he'd like her to accompany him. The next scene shows a misty, quiet, early morning Auschwitz camp. The camera pans around the museum exhibits where there's photographs of piles of bodies before cutting to an outside overview where Deborah, Rampton's legal assistant, and their German guide, or Polish guide it might be, are waiting for Richard Rampton, assuming he's late. We, however, see he's walking the perimeter, taking notes as he goes. So, yeah. She going back to the bit about London, it was a hotel she stayed in at first, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, it was a hotel, but they had a separate self-contained one-bedroom flat. And according to the book, if I've read it correctly, the people that ran the hotel said you can stay there for free as long as you want at the trial, which was a great relief for her, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And then we get to see this Richard Rampton character, and he's pretty accurately portrayed in the movie, I believe, as they show. He loved to drink, and he didn't need much encouragement to buy a round for everybody or produce a bottle in the evening when they were travelling. At first, as the movie shows, Lipstadt was a bit wary of him, and he questioned his motives and strategy. But as the movie shows, as it unfolds, by the end, she knows that he's smart, hard-working, and when it came to his strategy, he was proved right. The Auschwitz scenes shown are quite accurate, but in reality it was a much bigger group, more researchers than I think the 4 or 5 people that they show. But other than that, it's all pretty accurate, and I'm sure it must have been filmed on site as well, so that would have added the accuracy.
I believe the external shots were shot on site, but they were asked... Auschwitz has a blanket policy of no filming inside, so everything that was done inside was a set, I think. I'm pretty sure that's
Right.
correct. So, go on.
We've had this conversation, I think, over Schindler's List, but you've not been to Auschwitz, have you?
No, I haven't. I've been to Bergen-Belsen, which is a museum, and then just very well tended earthen. They're like they look like underwater water reserve, like slightly raised rectangular bits, and it'll just say 800 here, 1600 are buried here. You know that you hear these myths that no birds sing there, and it's not true, but it's a very awe-inspiring place.
Sobering, yeah.
Back to the movie. So we're at Auschwitz. Rampton meets the guide, and he's very blunt. He cuts to what he needs. He needs to see the plans of the site, and he says, we're not here on a pilgrimage, we're seeking legal evidence. They have drawings made by a French survivor of the camp who was an artist, and we learn how the prisoners were taken past a sign that said, to the baths, and then into a gas chamber. The guide tells Rampton and Deborah that the gas chambers were dynamited by the Germans in the autumn of 1944 as they were pulling back in the face of the Russian advance. He shows the plans to them, pointing out the holes in the roof through which Zyklon B crystals, which is sometimes in the movie they refer to hydrogen cyanide, but Zyklon B was a form of hydrogen cyanide, so it's the same thing. And they were poured into the chambers through these holes to kill those inside. Next, they visit the delousing chambers, and we learn that Zyklon B was also used to kill the lice that infested the prisoners' clothes. And this is where we first hear mention of a Holocaust denier who tasked an engineer called Fred Leuchter. And we've got a clip.
We need to talk about Leuchter.
Yes, I'm coming to Leuchter.
Yeah.
This building was used to delouse the prisoners' clothing. They used Zyklon B for that too, to kill the lice.
We know that?
Yes?
For sure, you have proof? I mean, you can't take anything for granted. I need to see the proof.
Yes, I can give you proof. However, in February 1988, a Holocaust denier called Ernst Zundel sent Fred Leuchter, an engineer and self-styled execution expert from America, to test in different parts of the camp for evidence of poison gas in the brickwork. Traces of hydrogen cyanide, HCN. The blue stains here and here.
He came with a chisel,
That's right.
and he hacked away.
Correct.
Illegally, without any permission from the authorities. And then he smuggled the pieces out of Poland in his suitcase, wrapped in his dirty underwear.
Be that as it may, we can criticize his methods, but it's his conclusions we have to discredit.
He found higher levels of HCN here in the delousing chambers than he did in the gas chambers themselves. From this, he concluded that no human beings were killed at Auschwitz, only lice were killed.
Why are we talking about Leuchter? I mean, he's really not worth the paper he's written on.
Well, so you say. Now say why.
I'll tell you why.
Because of course there was a higher concentration in here. It takes 20 times more cyanide to kill lice than it does human beings. 20 times! Just Leuchter didn't know that.
Oh, this whole thing is infuriating. I know.
It beggars belief. Why has there not been a proper scientific study of this whole site by reputable scientists? 50 years since the fact. I mean, it's ridiculous. Where's the proof? Where's the evidence? I need to know that.
You know what? This is a place where you show respect. Whoever you are, you show respect.
I have to ask some more questions. Would you be happier outside? What proof is there that Leuchter...
And this is, Deborah does leave. She goes outside and she says a prayer as Rampton, still inside, can be heard asking his very sort of objective, cold, scientific questions. And you see this clash between them, you know, her, this is Auschwitz, you show respect here. And he's furious that there's not been a full scientific survey done by proper sponsored, you know, reputable historians and archaeologists and the like. So, yeah, there's a bit of clash. So, from your research, how accurately was that portrayed?
Yeah, well, that was all very accurate. It tells us the story of what they were going to argue, but it is all very correct. The whole idea where they're looking where the Cyclone B came from, the whole business of the delousing chambers for the clothes versus the human beings getting gas with the same gas, that's all very, very accurate. And unfortunately, the whole Fred Lipstadt stuff about coming in and being an engineer that wants to prove his Holocaust denial theory by chipping bits of cement off the wall and stealing them out in his underwear, unfortunately, that is spot on.
Yeah,
despite
incredible.
how silly it seems, yeah.
And but the group who were there did have a reflective moment, didn't they?
They did. They all stopped and prayed, and she did start a prayer for a Jewish prayer for the dead, as the movie shows. So again, quite accurate.
Next, we cut to Krakow in Poland, where Deborah and Richard Rampton discuss the visit. She's still, and it's worth reminding people that Auschwitz is in modern-day Poland, not in East Germany. It doesn't exist anymore, in Germany. She's still pretty harsh with him, and they talk about their feelings, and she asks him what he felt. And he said he feels shame and worry that if he'd been a German at the time in order to do such things, he'd have obeyed out of cowardice. He then quotes Goethe in German, and Deborah says, "I thought you didn't speak German." And then you see this, it's brilliantly acted by Rachel Weisz, this realisation that he's learnt German in the last year purely to allow him to study all the documentation written in German. And he looks at her as if, well, of course I have. Irving's got decades of head start. I've had to catch up. He then reveals that they don't want a jury, preferring a single judge. She's really surprised at this, and he says, look, we have to get Irving to agree, but we don't know yet how the legal team plan to get his agreement, but he explains to her that a jury could be swayed by emotion or, the presenter they like the most, and they can't risk Irving being able to charm them, so they need a single judge. He also, this is where he reveals to her, they don't want her to testify. She's absolutely horrified and furious and says, "You don't need to protect me." He says, "No, we're not protecting you. We want to keep the focus on Irving. Everything you have to say has been said in your books. If we put you on the stand, it will feed Irving, and we want to starve him." She worries that people will say she's a coward. Rampton doesn't deny this, but he says, maybe, but that is the price of victory. That's really fascinating.
But it's all true. It's all pretty accurate. They did have a conversation similar to this in the evening with in Krakow, but I think it was with the bigger group. I don't think it was just the two of them. But as we see in the movie, she is learning that this Rampton fellow is quite formidable and clearly a clever man. And the bit about wanting to entice Irving to go with a judge-only trial, not a jury trial, that's all correct too, and they thought that they might entice him by appealing to his vanity and his intellect. I'm pretty sure, though, that the shock that Deborah's got that she won't be presenting at this conversation, won't be testifying at this dinner in Krakow, I'm pretty sure that they would have, laid that on her up front and early, not later in the piece as this suggests, but it is definitely true. She wasn't to talk despite her best efforts to want to talk, to defend herself and her work. She had to bite her tongue. She didn't get to go in the jury, in the trial, in the witness box as she'd hoped, and this was a big deal to her, and she had to really try and digest this, but I assume it would have been well before the fact-finding mission to Auschwitz.
Yeah, sure, that makes sense. So back in the movie, Anthony Julius is at a meeting with David Irving, and they're addressing a court official. Julius says that they feel the complexities of the historical facts may be beyond a jury of lay people, and they feel that the case would be better considered by a judge alone. Julius flatters Irving's ego by saying it may be hard to teach average members of the public what it's taken Irving a lifetime of study to master. Irving predictably agrees, so the trial will be decided by a single judge. We then jump to day one of the court hearings, so we see Deborah arrive as TV crews and journalists try and interview her, but Anthony Julius hurries her through, saying she mustn't talk to anyone. There are also hecklers present. Some are pro-Irving and some are against him. We hear threats shouted at Deborah, but she gets safely inside, only to look back to see Irving happily giving interviews. She comments on this to Julius and he says, the only opinion that matters is the judge's. He also warns her that she should vary her jogging route in the morning. And she kind of looks at him with a, wow. I guess she's realising for the first time that actually her safety might be in... Yeah. So, how did they do?
Oh, really good. That's spot on. I mean, as I've already suggested, they were going to appeal to Irving's vanity, saying that this was a complex matter and you have to be really special like a judge to be able to digest it. So he took the bait, exactly as they show. And then on day one of the trial, with all this media interest, she was very surprised at that. She thought it must have been for some high-profile crime case in the same courts that she was attending, and took her a little while to realise, no, this was for her in a libel case. So yeah, there was a lot of interest and there were demonstrations on both sides. So maybe the bit about being in fear of harm or in fear of a life, that might well be true as well.
I remember the court case happening, and I'm trying to think where I was. I think I was serving in Northern Ireland at the time. And I remember an officer who had done European history as a degree, and I said to him, David Irving, I said, he's a fairly established historian, isn't he? And he said, yeah, he is. He said, but in his early work is really good. He said, but someone's got to him, and he's turned into he said, basically everything he writes is now with a political agenda. And he said, no, and this officer was immediately, he is a Holocaust denier. He's a liar. Yeah. He said, no one takes him seriously these days. He's gone a bit crackpot. Anyway, back to the movie. So in court, Deborah's surrounded by a team of 6 or 7 legal types, whilst Irving is alone at his end of the bench, and Julius looks at her and mutters, as advertised, David and Goliath. So Irving's setting himself up as the little man standing up against the might of the publishers.
But yeah, well, that might justify the optics of the jury would have to digest the David and Goliath scene. It sort of emphasises the fact that going before a judge was probably a very wise call on their part.
Yeah, and the thing is, that scene where Anthony Julius is saying, you know, I'm an educated man, I've extensively read, and I really struggle with some of the complexities of this era. And, you know, Mr. Irving has taken decades to reach his level of expertise. Can we really expect a lay jury to... And you can see Irving sat there stroking his chin going, yes, I am brilliant, you're right, which is not quite what he said, but it's kind of obvious, but it works beautifully. Anyway, so we're back to the opening scenes. The judge enters and everyone has to stand. And Julius says to Deborah, he says, bow. And she went, I don't bow, I'm an American, which I thought was an absolutely brilliant line. It goes without comment. No one complains that she doesn't dip her head. Irving speaks first, saying that far from being a Holocaust denier, he has shone light on hitherto unknown truths, yet thanks to Deborah Lipstadt and the publishers' campaign against him, he's been denied the opportunity to pursue his career as publishers turn away from him. He says he's become something of a pariah and compares it to having to wear a yellow star, which is yes,
breathtaking,
really,
isn't it?
Absolutely. It's like you're not trying to get anyone on your side here, are you? Except the sort of people who would already have been on his side anyway because of their twisted views. Anyway, next we see Richard Rampton speak. And interestingly, he does not look at David Irving, and this will be a theme. He says Irving is not a historian, he is a liar. He compares 2 versions of Irving's histories of Hitler. He points out that in a 1970s version it follows the established and accepted version that Hitler ordered the Holocaust. Yet in a 1990s revised edition, all references to this have disappeared. Rampton suggests that this is down to one word, Leuchter, and he references the Leuchter report, which we first heard of during the visit to Auschwitz. Rampton says the Leuchter report was bunkum and was promoted by Irving because he wanted it to be true. During a recess, we see that everyone troops outside of the court, and in the hallways, Deborah is approached by a camp survivor. She shows Deborah her tattooed number and wants to know why she and the other survivors haven't been called to testify. She begs to be allowed to make their voices heard, not for them, but for those whose voices were stilled. Deborah makes an emotional promise that the voices of the sufferers will be heard, and joining the legal team, she takes Anthony Julius aside and tries to push the idea about putting them on the stand. Julius is absolutely unmoved and says they are not on trial, Irving is. She makes a final appeal saying she promised their voices will be heard, and he coldly tells her to go back out there and break her promise. Ouch. That is quite dramatic.
Yeah, and quite accurate. I mean, the lady that with the conversation and the court recess, she represents obviously an amalgam of people that approach Lipstadt, but it is all correct. You know, there were people that desperate to have their day in court, wanting to, you know, say that it happened, and it's ridiculous to say otherwise. But and there was a fellow in the book that approached her, Holocaust survivor, Auschwitz survivor. He was a he, not a she, and she did stay in touch with him several times during the trial. And I think that that's who this woman is starting to represent, is trying to represent. Yeah, and the bit about Rampton, as you've mentioned, he doesn't look him in the eye or acknowledge him. That's quite true. Rampton referred to Irving in the third person, and he refused to look him in the eye, except in key moments of the trial when he tried to accuse him of something, tried to unnerve him. So he was playing psychological games, as you've suggested already. Yeah. So look, all pretty good, but I don't think the bit about Lecter in the opening speech of Rampton. So I think what they've done here, as we've already suggested, is they've compressed months worth of testimony into a nice speech by Rampton, which is good for the movie. But as we've seen with other movies, it's a Hollywood device to, you know, progress the narrative, which we shouldn't take months to, you know, would never try to portray months of a trial.
No. So back to the movie. Everyone's back in court, where Irving is examining a German historian who we learn wrote a book about Auschwitz. Irving asked the professor why the Russian documents recorded just after the liberation of the camp make no mention of gas chambers. The professor says, well, I don't know, I'd need to examine such documents before I could give an opinion. Moving on, the professor shows a simulation of how the killings took place. Irving pushes him about a technical aspect, saying the pillars within the chamber go up to the roof, whereas the professor's writings say the pillars go through the roof. And the professor explains this is how the Zyklon B crystals were introduced into the chambers. Irving argues there's no evidence that there were any holes in the roofs of the chambers, therefore these couldn't have been hollow pillars to introduce cyanide crystals, proving that those who claim such things are liars. And he shouts the final words, hence my strange delivery there. The German professor asks the judge if he may respond, and the judge says, you may, but it's nearly 4 p.m, so not until the following day, and they retire for the day. And Deborah's quite upset because, you know, it's like, oh, so Irving gets to leave that in everyone's minds. And again, we come back to this thing of the only mind that matters is the judge. Okay, so we've seen the first witnesses up there. How did they do on these bits, Andrew?
Pretty good. I mean, they've got a couple of witnesses in the movie to convey what the court was like and that there was people were splitting hairs. But in reality, it went on for much longer than the couple of witnesses that the movie shows. In reality, there were historians that were sympathetic to Irving and historians that were not. And there were some that were being called by Irving's side that were downright hostile to being put into his corner. So in other words, there are historians that thought that he was a charlatan, and they were literally offended to be called to the courts and forced to appear on his side as he is nitpicking their own work, trying to get them to say, yes, you're right in what you're saying. So there was a wide variety of people, some sympathetic, generally not sympathetic, and some were downright hostile, even though they were Irving's witnesses. And the stuff, the whole trying to figure out if there were holes to drop the Zyklon B, and that was a big part of the trial too. So they went down lots of little rabbit holes like that to us seem quite ridiculous, but it is an accurate reflection of some of the conversations that they had in the courts.
Sure. So the court's finished for the day, back to the movie this is, and we see Deborah being hustled out by Julius, and the survivor we met earlier calls out to her saying this is a disaster, and Deborah pretty much agrees with her. Richard Rampton, however, appears unperturbed, saying Irving is indulging in amateur dramatics and it's unimportant. The team have images of the holes atop the chambers and they'll introduce this evidence the next day. Deborah is furious, saying Irving is making it respectable and acceptable to debate whether mass killings really took place, making it a matter of opinion, not a matter of fact. Julius's young lawyer, the young chap, one of his research lawyers, jumps in at a point to point out that Irving didn't choose Auschwitz as his point of focus because everyone's heard of it. He chose it because it wasn't built as an extermination camp, but a labour camp that was then later adapted. Julius points out that Irving is trying to cast doubt on one tiny detail, which, if he can hold it up as plausible, then allows him to cast doubt on the whole premise of the Holocaust. Deborah demands that as the client, she's calling the shots and she and the survivors will testify. Richard Rampton doesn't answer it, he just gives a weary goodnight and leaves, pursued by an increasingly shrill and angry Deborah Lipstadt. She's intercepted by Anthony Julius, who points out that Rampton is leaving to prepare. He dedicates every waking moment to the case and nothing else. She comes back to the evidence of the survivors saying they're eyewitnesses, at which point Julius shows Deborah a video of Irving ripping apart survivor testimony in previous such cases, not necessarily court cases, but
debates and like.
There's a video of one lady showing her Auschwitz tattoo or her camp tattoo, and Irving laughingly says, "Just how much money has she made out of that tattoo?" Julius points out that survivors rarely remember every small detail, and if Irving can show one error of memory, he will completely destroy their credibility. He will humiliate them. We then cut to see Richard Rampton at his desk, drinking whiskey, smoking cigarettes and writing notes. And he stares at a small piece of barbed wire picked up from Auschwitz as we cut to the next morning. So, again, Rampton's reaction and sticking to plan A, it seems to be pretty much what they did.
Yeah, that is correct. And the whole business about her wrestling with not giving evidence, she, as I say, she towed the line. I assume by now she... I think what they've done is they've dramatised some of the reactions for effect, but the tone is perfectly correct. They might have compressed... she might have had these doubts or these wrestles with herself earlier than what the movie portrays, but that's quibbling. It's very accurate. The only thing I think that they've added is the barbed wire from Auschwitz. I think that's a dramatic invention, very effective, but not mentioned in the book, I don't recall.
That's right, because when they were walking over one of the roofs of the collapsed chambers, he was told, be very careful walking around here, it's not been cleared, and then he trod on a piece of barbed wire, didn't it, which went through the sole of his shoe, I think, and he's obviously kept it. So, possibly a dramatic invention, but a forgivable one. Yeah.
Exactly.
So, back to the movie, and we're back in court the next day, and Rampton is examining David Irving himself. He asks Irving why the Polish authorities found high levels of cyanide on the gratings from some of the gassing cellars. And Irving agrees with him. He doesn't argue. He says, oh, yes, but this was to fumigate corpses. He said this was a mortuary. Now, we've got a clip. Now, it's quite a long clip, much longer than we normally do. So a few minutes, but it's worth hearing it just to hear how Rampton just nails him. So here we go.
So now, Mr. Irving, I will ask you to explain why, if, as you claim, there were no gas chambers in Auschwitz, the gratings taken in 1945 by the Polish authorities from Morgue 1 in Crematorium 2 were covered in cyanide, and why the camp's chief architect, Karl Bischoff, specifically refers to Morgue 1 as a Vergassungskeller. A gassing cellar. Well?
I am willing to concede that they did indeed find, in the ventilator gratings, traces of cyanide.
They did?
Yes. I will also concede that it was indeed used as a gassing cellar.
It was?
Yes.
Good. So, gassing what?
Well, I think the evidence is clear that the room was used as a gassing cellar for fumigating cadavers.
Fumigating cadavers?
Yes.
Why exactly do you say that?
That is what mortuaries are for. In mortuaries, you put cadavers.
What is the evidence that that room was used for gassing corpses?
That is what it was built for.
I'm sorry, this seems a crude question, but what is the point of gassing a corpse?
Because, my lord, they came in heavily infested with the typhus-sparing lice which had killed them.
Did they? Did they, Mr. Irving? Did they indeed? Then please explain to me why they needed a gas-proof door with a peephole with double 8mm glass and a metal grille on the inside.
You will remember at this time, most of Germany was under the weight of Royal Air Force Bomber Command. There was a concern about the need to build bomb-tight shelters.
So now it's an air raid shelter, is it?
Beg your pardon?
It is either a room for gassing already dead corpses, or it's an air raid shelter.
Did I say either or?
In early 1943, an air raid shelter? When you know perfectly well that the first bombing raid near Auschwitz wasn't until late 1944. And the placing of this so-called air raid shelter, if it was for the SS, it was a terribly long way from the SS barracks, wasn't it? Have you thought of that? That's 2.5 miles, isn't it? If there was a bombing raid, they'd all be dead before they got there. But can you really see lots of very heavily armed men running the 2.5 to 3 miles from the SS barracks to a cellar at the far end of Birkenau? You see, I'm trying to understand if there was this dual function, so see if you can help me. Now, if the corpses were also gassed there, then as I understand it, they were then sent to be incinerated.
Yes.
What is the point in gassing a corpse that is about to be burnt?
I'm not sure saying this off the top of my head, Mr. Rampton. I'm not a Holocaust historian. I'm a Hitler historian.
Then why don't you keep your mouth shut about the Holocaust? The truth is, as usual, Mr. Irving, you jump in off the board spouting whatever rubbish comes into your head in order to avoid the obvious conclusion. This is not because you're a rotten historian. It's because you're a bent one as well.
Yeah, it's combative stuff, and I don't know, you just get the feeling that this is a boy playing with men. You know, Rampton's the man and Irving's the boy, and he's just not quite on the same level of managing to you know, get his arguments lined up and coherent, and he's clearly not used to talking to people with a higher intellect than himself. I'm not saying he's stupid, but you know, if he's going to address right-wing rallies, he's probably not getting the cream of society's intellectual quality listening to what he's got to say, you know.
Well, let's hope so, yeah.
And those arguments, that's pretty much, I mean, I guess a lot of the court scenes are taken from court records.
That's right, yeah. All this stuff was definitely mentioned, whether it was all in one conversation as they neatly show in the movie, but that's quibbling again. This is a pretty accurate portrayal of some of the arguments that, and the cute and clever little arguments that Irving used when he was in the stand. So again, very accurate.
Yeah, and you know, the bit about, well, no, it was also used as an air raid shelter, even though the RAF weren't bombing that part of Poland and Germany for another 18 months. And why would you build an air raid shelter nearly 3 miles away from where your barracks are? And there's this image that Rampton conjures up of all these SS men tumbling out of bed and having to run 3 miles. I mean, I think the air raid would be over by the time they got there. So it's clearly nonsense, and it's just risible, but the tragedy, as you mentioned earlier, is that some people take this sort of crap seriously. Anyway, the court back to the movie. The court goes into recess, and Deborah goes to speak with the survivor lady we met earlier, but in the end, she ends up just sitting down with her, and they hold hands. Rampton sees them together, and you see him look quite thoughtful towards them, and then he walks off. Later that evening, Deborah is surprised when he knocks at her door. He's brought wine, and he mumbles, I thought it'd be interesting to see where you live. And he accepts a compliment about how their day went. Deborah's noticed that he never looks at Irving, and he says, no, it's my way of showing him what I think of him. And she also offers him an apology for what she said to him during their visit to Auschwitz, and now realises that he wasn't late, he was pacing out distances, and he said, well, of course, it's a crime scene. I had to visit it, and concedes that when he went, he had no idea what to expect. He tells her that she can stand up, look Irving in the eye, and tell the world what she knows, and risk losing, and what happens then? And she says, or And he replies, sit, be quiet, and win. An act of self-denial to achieve victory. And through quiet tears, she agrees. And from what you've said, this conversation with her undoubtedly would have happened, but your feeling is it happened much earlier. She was already, by the time they got to court, she knew that she would not be testifying.
No, but the book does detail how anguishing that was for her. But she pushed back on the strategy. But she was towing the line by now. But as the movie suggests, she was starting to realise that Rampton was quite a clever fellow and was impressed by his overall strategy by about this time. So they got that tone right for sure.
I mean, she makes an interesting point. She was brought up to be independent, not to rely on anybody else. And you can see it's so difficult for her to relinquish control and trust this aristocratic Scottish, barrister. But she manages to do it, and all power to her elbow for it.
Yeah, and she says in the book that Deborah, the figure in the Bible, is a judge and a warrior leader for the Jewish people, and she tries to embrace that spirit. And it was really hard for her to bite her tongue and just sort of be humble and let the greater strategy guide her actions. So it was an ongoing theme through the book that this was a tussle for her, and they definitely portray that in the movie, don't they?
Indeed, and they do it very well. So back to the movie, we next see Rampton in his robes having breakfast in a cafe near the court, and he's joined by Deborah. He's eating a full English breakfast, which is basically everything's fried. Sausages, mushrooms, tomatoes, bacon, and it complete with black pudding, which she's horrified to learn is fried blood. And she does say to him, are you hoping to make it to the end of the court? He warns her that they have to prove that Irving deliberately altered the evidence for his own political ends, or they will lose. If they can only show that Irving made honest mistakes, errors, that's not good enough for them. So we cut to the court, where the judge tells Irving that he needs to address this defence allegation against him. An expert witness is on the stand talking about a memo sent by Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS. And the memo is from 1941, and it states, the translation states, the Jew transport from Berlin, no liquidation. The expert continues to say that in Irving's book, he deliberately mistranslates this memo as if it came from Hitler, and that this memo talks about a single transport, but in Irving's book, it's been changed to imply it's an order covering all Jews, not just this single event from Berlin. Irving makes his defence that he may have made a mistake, but this could be an honest mistake. The professor on the stand says, no, I don't think so. I don't believe that's possible. I believe that your error was deliberate. So again, as you mentioned earlier, we've got I assume it's either Irving's witness or maybe it's Rampton's, and Irving is cross-examining. But these historians, few of them are giving much support to Irving's arguments.
That's right, and the book, it takes on this issue in some great detail, and then it gives more and more examples very similar to this, where he mistranslates a word and then he opens up a chink of light which he drives a truck through to say that the whole issue of Hitler and the Holocaust and him knowingly doing it is all just a fabrication, which is breathtaking in its ignorance. But when Lipstadt met some of the historical researchers that were going to nitpick and have a look at every single piece of writing that Irving's ever done on World War II, she picked up that some of them weren't so happy to be there. She suggests that some of the team might have been sympathetic to Irving, and that but by this time of the trial, everyone that had examined his work had come around to believe that he was deliberately misrepresenting stuff to suit his arguments. He tries to say that it was an honest mistake, but there were dozens and dozens and dozens of such honest mistakes, which allow him to suggest something, and then, as I say, open up the argument of some amazing things like that Hitler not only wasn't for the Holocaust, he was intervening in individual cases to try and save some Jewish individuals. I mean, it's just ridiculous stuff. And everyone, as I say, everyone involved in the examination knew that he was conveniently turning away from some truths or misrepresenting others.
And fascinatingly, I think this is one of the bits where I think the movie does a brilliant little thing. Because we're back in the movie, and one of the legal team, as you say, one of the research teams, I'm not even sure if the girl has a name in the movie, but she's been seen, and she's working away at night at her desk, and her boyfriend or maybe husband starts complaining, "Oh, come on, this is too much, this is becoming an obsession. Holocaust, Holocaust, Holocaust. At some point, isn't everyone going to have to let go?" Which kind of reflects, this is the audience into which Irving is trying to tap, I guess. But more worryingly, this kid probably wouldn't even, as a young man, he probably wouldn't agree with Irving. He doesn't care. And I think that's the fear, that people who just say, "Oh yeah, it's just something that happened," and we'll lose that perspective on a lesson of what humans are capable of. And I mean, going back to the whole Hitler thing, whether Hitler gave the order or not, whether he was knowing or not, it doesn't take away the magnitude of the crime. It doesn't take away the suffering of the individuals, whoever ordered it. I don't think there's any doubt that Hitler did order it, but, who cares? He was the captain of the ship, and I'm afraid the responsibility lands firmly on his desk. And of course he dodged all the repercussions by taking his own life. But anyway, so this scene, the girl working absolutely ignores her boyfriend/husband and just continues working. And the next day, we view a video of Irving addressing a meeting in Florida, saying the Holocaust is boring, the Jews keep going on about it because it's the only interesting thing that's happened to them in the last 3,000 years, which kind of makes you wonder if Irving has actually read any history books himself. Rampton challenges him on the topic of the Holocaust, quoting several Irving statements about him knowing no normal people who don't find it utterly boring, but they can't say that because it's politically incorrect. Then we see a video clip of Irving addressing something called the Clarendon Club, whatever that is, adds Rampton, which is a lovely put down. On screen, Irving is saying, "The next thing I know, one of them is reading the news to us." Challenged over this statement, we learn that he's talking about watching the BBC News, and the newsreader in question was Trevor MacDonald, a black newsreader. Irving says it was part of a standard speech he used to give, and in doing so he denies that he's a racist, and we've got a clip.
If they could have their own news, which they were reading to us, I suppose it would be very interesting. But for the time being, I'd be prepared to accept that the BBC should have a dinner-jacketed gentleman reading the important news, followed by a lady reading the less important news, followed by Trevor MacDonald giving us all the latest news on muggings and drug busts.
Rest lost in loud laughter and applause. Are you not appalled by that?
Not in the least. This was a witty speech delivered after dinner to an audience at a private club.
You were talking to a bunch of racists.
Well, they were not. They were perfectly ordinary guests.
Ordinary people? Then why were there cheers?
Well, obviously, they liked the jokes.
Mr. Irving, I think you might be advised to have a look at your own diary, if you wouldn't mind. A quiet evening at home. Jessica. Who is Jessica?
My little infant child.
Yes.
She was 9 months old at the time.
9 months old in September 1994. Jessica is turning into a fine little lady. She sits very upright on an ordinary chair, a product of our regular walks to the bank, I am sure. On those walks, we sing the binkety-bankety-bong song. She stars in a poem when half-breed children are wheeled past. And then you go into italics. I am a baby Aryan, not Jewish or sectarian. I have no plans to marry an ape or Rastafarian. Racist, Mr. Irving? Anti-Semitic, Mr. Irving?
I do not think so.
Teaching your little child this kind of poison?
Do you think a 9-month-old can understand words spoken in English or any other language?
This poor little child has been taught a racist ditty by her racist and perverted father.
Have you ever read Edward Lear? Hilaire Belloc?
They haven't brought a libel action, Mr. Irving. You have. You sued because you said that we had called you a racist and an extremist.
Yes. But I'm not a racist.
Mr. Irving, look at the words on the page.
So we can see that whatever David Irving might say, he's xenophobic, racist, misogynist. I mean, I don't know what else you want to throw at him. Almost certainly homophobic. But it's this lot of moral gymnastics he does. If all this evidence is there, he said, yes, it was just a clip. They thought the jokes were funny.
Yes, exactly.
I'm not a racist.
Yeah, he hangs him. He hoists himself on his own potato. Yeah, that all came across in the trial, and he tried to dismiss it as, just humorous banter to some select audience. Yeah, that's all true, amazingly.
And I think the most sinister thing is the little ditty to his daughter.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. He wrote that down.
Okay, so back to court, or back to the movie. Leaving court, Irving's saying to some news people, he said, I can't be racist. I've employed domestic staff from Barbados, India, Pakistan, all very attractive young ladies with lovely breasts, which sort of makes you do a double take. Well, is that true?
It is true. According to the book, that's exactly what he said, and that he was an inclusive employer because he has young women from all different parts of the world, mainly, and they all have lovely breasts. I don't know how he thinks that's going to somehow exonerate him in this matter. And
staggering. It's absolutely staggering. So we cut back to court for closing statements. A news reporter then tells us that we hear him giving his report and they expect the judge to take at least 4 weeks to decide his verdict. Richard Rampton is highlighting multiple errors in Irving's work during his summing up, and he uses as an analogy saying that if the mistakes are honest, it's a bit like the waiter who always gives the wrong change. If it's honest mistakes, sometimes the incorrect change will favour the customer and sometimes it will favour the restaurant. But in Irving's case, they always favour his views. So it can't be. At this point, the judge asked to clarify one point. He says to Rampton, is it fair to say that Irving may be an anti-Semitic, but an honest one, and therefore he may not be deliberately misleading, but stating the facts as he believes them to be? This caused a bit of a ripple of concern through Deborah's legal team. Rampton argues persuasively, but Deborah and the team are looking at each other, and she turns to Anthony Julius and says, what the heck just happened? She doesn't quite use the word heck. She uses something a bit stronger, but, it's like, ouch.
That is correct. And then there was more than one time when the judge would, stop and ask a question and seem to be very sympathetic to Irving's line of argument, and that did get Deborah and her team worried. This is a good representation of one of those times, but there was several, and they really worried that the judge wouldn't come down on the right side of history. And in Deborah's book, she went to some lengths to say that apparently in the British legal system, if you do decide to represent yourself, the judges will be very lenient. They will, interrupt, check that you understand what's going on, be very helpful to you rather than get annoyed and saying, why don't you just get a lawyer? I wonder if it's because in the American system, if you're the defendant, they'll appoint a lawyer for you. And we have this impression that, anyone who represents himself has, a fool for a client. So I would get the impression that a judge would be very short with somebody representing themselves, but that's not true in the British instance. Apparently they will be, really make sure that you understand what you're saying, what you're doing, and every time he did that and cut some slack to Irving, it got Deborah and her team, naturally got them very worried.
I mean, in the British system, if you're accused of a criminal offence and you don't have the money to appoint your own legal team, you will have state appointed. In a similar to the public defender, that will happen. But in a civil case where you've chosen to take it yourself, it's up to you to stump up. If you win your case, the other side will be expected to meet your legal costs, but you've got to have the money in the first place, unless you can find, as Deborah did with Anthony Julius and his team, someone who's willing to do it on a pro bono basis. But okay, so we cut back to Deborah at home in the US, and she's telling her friend how it all ended with that weird question from the judge. As she's talking to her friend, we cut to see the judge poring over papers and making notes. Deborah's shocked and worried that the judge may not be as objective as they'd assumed. And we've also found out that the legal team will be told the verdict 24 hours before she learns it, so they can prepare a response. Irving will also be told a day early, as he's representing himself, but she won't be told. We then see a historian on TV, and he's saying, well, this is really worrying that he's being taken to court, because any historian would be concerned about their work being subjected to a similar examination, especially if it might have legal implications. So this guy's suggesting that it might inhibit
free speech,
future research.
Yeah, that's right. But he's forgetting the fact that it was Irving that brought this. She's the defendant, not Irving. But anyway.
Yeah, exactly. But so Deborah, we see her teaching her students. She's talking about how difficult it would have been for normal Germans to have refused to do what was asked of them during the war. She said lots of people say, oh, I'd have said no. He said, really? Although going back to the Great Escape, remember when we said they could have refused? There was not one documented case of the Germans executing a soldier for refusing to carry out an order of, executing prisoners, even SS and Gestapo. There was that some of them were reprimanded or they were reduced in rank. And I think a couple got custodial sentences, but they were only for a few weeks. So maybe they could have refused, but anyway, it's easy for us to comment on that here. So back in the movie, Anthony Julius calls Deborah to say they should expect to be told the verdict the following Tuesday. And she says, can we have a code so you can let me know, but I'll just pretend that I don't know, I'll look surprised. And he said, yeah, and then I'll be disbarred from practicing law ever again. So they're not going to tell Deborah what the result is. She flies to London, she meets the team, she's desperately trying to read their expressions, and they are absolutely deadpan. As they approach the court, we hear some hecklers calling Deborah Jewish scum, and then Irving is also being heckled, and he's egged, someone chucks an egg at him, and a woman screams, shame on you, you Nazi lover. So there are, feelings are high on both sides. The court assembles, Deborah's glaring at Irving, the judge pours himself tea in his rooms as the statements are handed out to the press, but the verdict is blank. For that, everyone has to wait. The judge tells them that he'll read his judgment, and as he goes through, very quickly we realise he is fully on side with Deborah Lipstadt and Penguin Books, and he finds in their favour. The judge rises and leaves, the team hug and grin at each other. Irving looks nothing more than really disgruntled. He tries to congratulate Richard Rampton, a fight well fought, and offers his hand. Rampton absolutely ignores him, and he just walks away. He just turns his back as if he wasn't even there. Outside, Deborah receives Julius's blessing to speak to the press, but then she can actually think of nothing to say, or very little to say, other than she feels great. Then we see her at a press conference with the Penguin Books representative, where she's had a bit more time to, gather her thoughts. And she points out that she didn't bring an action. David Irving brought the action. And we've got a little clip here about, she talks just very briefly about free speech, but it's something that's, I think, is becoming a bit of a theme for us.
Some people are saying that the result of this trial will threaten free speech. Now, I don't accept that. I'm not attacking free speech. On the contrary, I've been defending it against someone who wanted to abuse it.
Well, freedom of speech means you can say whatever you want. What you can't do is lie and then expect not to be accountable for it.
Not all opinions are equal. And some things happen, just like we say they do. Slavery happened. The Black Death happened.
The earth is round, the ice caps are melting.
And Elvis is not alive.
So we'll just wrap up. She congratulates the team, asked if she'd say anything to David Irving. She says no, nothing. She'd rather say to the survivors that they are remembered, as are their voices. Finally, we hear Irving being ragged by Jeremy Paxman, who, for anyone who's not aware, is a legendary political interviewer on British television and famously combative. Irving tries to pretend he won most of the arguments, but the judge was too stupid to understand the facts. Julius calls Deborah, and they're both watching this, and they're laughing at the absurdity of Irving's claims. And the final scene, we cut back to Auschwitz, and we see snow falling on the ground, and the end.
Wow. That was all that last bit that you've just given us is all very, very accurate. The business about the lawyers knowing 24 hours before the participants is correct. So Irving, as the lawyer for himself, he would have known what the verdict was, while Deborah had to wait another 24 hours. The tension in the courts, for the verdict, I think that's correct as per the book. And the judge coming down completely on Deborah's side in every single possible count. and on Penguin's side, that's correct too. I think it's all those last scenes wrapping things up quite quickly are very, very accurate to reality.
Well, interestingly, the officer I mentioned earlier that I'd spoken to when this court started, and I remember the case took weeks and weeks, but I happened to be flying with him in a helicopter a few weeks later, and I'd noticed the outcome, the verdict, and he commented and he said, "You saw the Irving verdict?" And I went, "Well, yeah, duh. English, British judge decides the Holocaust did happen." And he said, no, it's more than that. He said, of course it did, and anyone with an ounce of intelligence knows it did. But the judge found that David Irving had deliberately tried to alter facts, he said, and that's what everyone has to be so careful about. That in time it's gradually diluted and the emphasis is changed to say, well, there's probably faults on both sides. No, not in this instance. But I remember at the time thinking, how did it even get to court? Because it did become, in the public perception, a judgment on the validity of people saying the Holocaust may not have happened, and that validity was completely blown away and smashed. Right. So, yeah. So you've got some interesting stuff of the aftermath and the background.
I learnt only this morning that what the movie doesn't show is that prior to the trial, Irving approached Lipstadt and Penguin, and he said he'd drop the whole matter if they apologised to him in writing for the way he was characterised in Lipstadt's book, and they could each pay £500 to a charity that he was nominating. So, the worries that Lipstadt had about giving him some credibility, she would have been really tempting for her to say, pay $500 and admit that we were wrong and it'll all go away. But Lipstadt and Penguin both declined. They were in this for the fight and to fight the good fight. What the movie doesn't show is that after this trial, Irving appealed the verdict twice. He escalated it twice at two subsequent trials, where he was this time represented by lawyers, but thankfully he was unsuccessful in both retrials or both appeals. And just to wrap up the two main characters, I guess. Lipstadt, who's now 72, and she continues to be a faculty member for Emory University in Georgia, where she created its Institute of Jewish Studies and was its first director until 2008 when she stepped down. But yeah, she's still at the same university.
The YouTube clip that we'll include in the show notes is worth a look about, because the real Deborah Lipstadt is interviewed in that, and she's wonderful. And Rachel Weisz looks nothing like her, but she really does capture that really quite combative spirit, but not a zealot. You don't get the impression that she's, a narrow-focused fanatic. She's just very, very determined.
Which is great.
Really impressive lady. And Irving.
Off you go.
Yeah, well, he's 82. He continued to attract controversy after the trial and appeals. He continued to give lectures to neo-Nazi groups in Germany and elsewhere, appeared regularly at events for Holocaust-denying groups, and one particular one, the Institute for Historical Review. In 2004, he was banned from visiting New Zealand. He was arrested and imprisoned in Austria in 2005. I remember this. He was taken to court in Austria and found guilty of anti-Holocaust laws. And it's in Germany and in Austria, it is against the law to deny that the Holocaust happened. In 2009, he started a website selling Nazi memorabilia. So, yeah, I think we can see the colour of your flag, as it were. His last publication was in 2008, and his last big public controversy was also in 2008, when he was invited to a Norwegian literary festival, which caused such a stir, and other people who'd been invited to go there and speak said, nah, not going. And eventually the invitation was withdrawn. And he used the bit about free speech, I believe, in the statement about that, saying, well, this is just typical, it's the global Jewish conspiracy shutting down debate. And it goes back to what Deborah said. I'm not closing down free speech. You can say whatever you like, but if you state something as a fact, you cannot expect not to be challenged. And this is something that our next outing on Larry Flynt will bring into such key focus. Now, Larry Flynt was the founder of Hustler magazine. He's a pornographer, soft pornography, and nonetheless, he's a pornographer. Many people may not agree with what it is he's trying to use the First Amendment, as it is in America, the right to free speech, to talk about or to publish. But the principle of free speech is fascinating. Principle that she's saying, you can say what you want, but if you state things as facts, expect to be challenged. And that is a basis that I think we can all get on board with and agree
Agreed.
with.
Yeah, and we'll go into that, no doubt, in a bit more detail with the next episode. But maybe we should wrap this one up first and give a comment on how we think the movie entertained us and how accurate it was from history.
I think from a filmmaker's perspective, or a film expert, which I am not, but from that sort of cinematography perspective, I can understand why it might get 7.5 or 8. But weirdly, the critics actually like it more. But the topic and the performances and how gripping I found it, I'm at least an 8, if not a 9, on entertainment.
I'm an 8. I don't think Rachel Weisz did a convincing American accent, for one. But, you know, I'll give it an 8. It definitely flew by while I was watching it. It was gripping. And I guess that's why they took a few inaccuracies with the timeline, at least. If they really, you know, had this long procession of witnesses as per the truth and long montages of people doing the research before the trial, I might not have found it so interesting. But yeah, I'll definitely give it an 8.
Yeah, I mean, Rachel Weisz is British American, I think she's described as.
Is she?
So I think one of the issues may have been there were times when it sounded like she was trying to do a bit of a Boston accent or a New York accent, and then accent might have migrated a little bit. But I'm not sure how much of my enjoyment, if that's the right word, was due to we're quite invested in this era of history and the importance of it. Really I guess I like to think I always have been, but certainly since Schindler's List, and also tying in with things like Selma, which have a similar sort of really deep importance that still resonates today, and we have to keep that gong ringing. Yeah. You know, we can't let it fall silent. Yeah. So maybe I'm a bit skewed, but yeah, I'd be comfortable with an 8, but equally I wouldn't find a 9 outrageous. On historical accuracy, I think again it's an 8 or a 9. It's
yeah.
There are no key staple facts that have been altered for entertainment or any other reason that I can see.
No, I do think that they got their tour guide, who's a historian from Poland. He appeared in the doc at one stage, and I don't recall that being the case. But that's such a minor quibble, using the same actor for a couple of roles. But historically, again, I've got the problem that I'm comparing it to a single book, and as far as I'm concerned, it's very accurate to that book. It compresses some things, as I've already said, but I'd have to give it an 8 or 9, I think, for historical accuracy.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. And I did realise that Jules and I forgot to give ratings to Social Network. And now I think for historical accuracy, it would probably hit a 6, maybe a 7. But for entertainment, I would have gone with a 9 for social. And sorry to Sean Munger, who didn't particularly like it. But you see, Sean made a really good point in his email to us. Remember when he said it talks about the technical genesis of Facebook, but not its implications. Now, I think Denial has done a much better job of saying, look, we're portraying some historical events, but you've got to go away and think about them. You've got to take this away and realise that this is more than just a defamation of character civil court or civil case in the UK. This is global and it's really important. So, yeah, if people haven't seen it, I don't think anyone will watch it and think it was boring. I suspect that most of our audience will have probably seen it. I know Gary Shavit will have done because he does his homework, and and so next time out, and we can't tell you when that is, but it's probably going to be late April, I'm going to guess. It's sometime in April, we hope. We'll get Larry Flynt, The People versus Larry Flynt out. I've just downloaded his audiobook autobiography, which I use as a starting point, being very aware that that's only one perspective on the man, and then start.
And after that, I think we've got Coal Miner's Daughter, the Loretta Lynn story.
Yeah, Loretta Lynn, who was a grandmother aged 29. which is frightening.
Anyway, that's for perhaps May, I think.
Probably. So we do apologise, but we want to keep loving doing this, and we want you to keep hearing us loving doing it, but we just can't sustain what we've been doing. So yay to us for what we've managed so far, and a big whew of relief that we won't have to keep that up, because it was going to start becoming a duty and a chore, and it should never be that.
Until next time, whenever that is, all the best.